The chamber was heavy with silence, the kind that only a Supreme Court hearing could hold. Reporters leaned forward, pens ready, cameras humming, the nation watching from every screen. Jasmine Crockett had just begun laying out her argument when the interruption cut through like a blade. Justice Amy Coney Barrett, her voice sharp and cold, leaned into the microphone. Is Congresswoman Crockett even fit to speak on constitutional law? The words didn't just land, they detonated. A ripple of gasps rolled through the courtroom. Eyebrows arched, whispers spread like fire, and for a brief moment, the air itself seemed to turn electric. It wasn't just a question. It was an insult wrapped in legal decorum, the kind of dismissal meant to reduce a woman, a black woman, to silence. The cameras caught everything. The flicker of smugness on Barrett's face, the uncomfortable shifting of colleagues, the stunned glance of clerks. It was the kind of remark that history remembers, the kind that reveals more about the speaker than the target. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't roll her eyes, didn't lash out, didn't even blink. She sat still, shoulders squared, gaze steady. In that silence, there was power. The pause wasn't weakness. It was thunder held back, waiting. Every second stretched longer than the last. The gallery held its breath. Reporters scribbled furiously, knowing they had just witnessed a line that would echo far beyond the marble walls. Barrett smirked, convinced she had landed the first blow. But the room felt different now, as if something larger than the insult itself had been unleashed. Crockett finally leaned forward, her lips parting just enough to signal that she would answer, but not yet. Not on Barrett's terms. The restraint itself was a statement. It told the court, the cameras, and the millions watching, I will not be dragged into pettiness. I will answer when the weight of truth demands it. What Barrett didn't know was that her words had already set the stage for her own undoing. She had opened a door that could never be closed, and the silence she mocked would soon erupt into a counterpunch so devastating, it would flip the Supreme Court upside down. But no one expected the counterpunch that would flip the Supreme Court upside down. The hearing wasn't just another day in Washington. This wasn't about partisan skirmishes or sound bites designed for the evening news. The case before the court carried consequences that would echo for generations. A ruling on voting access, on whether the most vulnerable communities, immigrants, the poor, people of color, would find doors open to their voice or locked out by technicalities dressed up as law. Every question asked, every argument made, was not just a performance but a battle for the soul of American democracy. And yet, in the days leading up to the hearing, pundits across the networks treated Jasmine Crockett as an afterthought. She doesn't belong here, one commentator sneered. She's out of her depth, another added, dismissing her as little more than a fiery soundbite machine. The narrative was cruelly predictable. A freshman congresswoman, a black woman from Texas, standing before the most powerful court in the land. To the cynics, it was laughable. To the entrenched establishment, it was offensive. Justice Barrett embodied that establishment. Cloaked in the gravitas of her robe, she was cast in the press as the guardian of tradition. To her supporters, she represented order, discipline, and a return to values they claimed were slipping away. But beneath that halo of judicial authority lay a darker truth. Her brand of tradition meant holding the gates closed. It meant preserving a hierarchy where voices like Crockett's were patronized, interrupted, or silenced altogether. That's why Barrett's words stung so sharply. They weren't a spontaneous jab. They were the distilled attitude of an entire class that believed power was theirs alone to define. When she questioned whether Crockett was even fit to speak on constitutional law, she wasn't just attacking one congresswoman. She was attacking the millions who saw themselves in her. People who had been told in classrooms, workplaces, and neighborhoods that their voices didn't matter, that their knowledge was insufficient, that their very presence was conditional. And that's what raised the stakes. Crockett knew she wasn't only speaking for herself. Her seat at that table was borrowed on behalf of everyone who had been told to sit down, to wait their turn, to accept less. Every word she spoke was freighted with their weight. Every pause carried the urgency of their silence. Around the country, people watching live felt that pressure. For them, this wasn't theater, it was personal. A young law student in Chicago, an immigrant father in Houston, an elderly activist in Georgia, they saw Crockett as their proxy in a chamber that rarely reflected their faces. She could not falter, because if she faltered, So too would the belief that ordinary people could ever rise to such heights. But Crockett's strength was never in showmanship. It was in her ability to stand calm against arrogance and let the truth reveal itself. And in that courtroom, as Barrett tightened her jaw and leaned back in satisfied silence, the contrast became blinding. One embodied the arrogance of inherited power. The other embodied the dignity of earned struggle. The nation felt the tension harden into a single question. Would Jasmine Crockett merely endure this trial, surviving the insult and proving her competence? Or would she do something greater, turn this moment into a reckoning, a turning point that would remind America who truly belongs in the rooms of power? The question wasn't just whether Crockett would survive, but whether she'd change history. To understand the force of Barrett's attack, you have to trace the carefully polished path that brought her to that bench. From the moment her name surfaced as a nominee, the story written around her was deliberate. A devout mother, a legal scholar, a paragon of so-called family values. The press releases glowed with praise. She was painted as a symbol of morality, a woman who could embody humility while carrying the weight of conservative power. But beneath the glossy narrative was something far less noble. Barrett's rise was not simply about legal brilliance or personal integrity. It was about being the perfect vessel for a political project. She was handpicked not for her independence, but for her predictability. The circles that elevated her wanted someone who looked unimpeachable, someone whose polished demeanor could mask a very old agenda, preserve power, narrow rights, and keep the gates closed to those who challenged their vision of America. The contradictions in her record reveal the truth. She spoke often of fairness, of applying the law evenly, of humility before the Constitution. Yet when the cases arrived that tested that humility, the scales always seemed to tip in one direction. Decisions that impacted corporations, religious power, or conservative priorities found her sympathetic. But when it came to protecting the marginalized, when it came to expanding access rather than restricting it, her rulings too often landed cold and selective. The robe was supposed to symbolize impartiality. In her hands, it became armor for ideology. Even her public persona carried that duality. To her admirers, Barrett projected a gentleness, the soft smile, the language of faith, the insistence that she approached her work with humility. But to her critics, that gentleness was a mask. Behind it was an arrogance sharpened by privilege, the confidence of someone who had always been told her place at the table was secure, who had never been asked to prove her worth in the way Crockett had her entire life. And perhaps that is why Barrett miscalculated so profoundly when she set her sights on Crockett. To her, the Congresswoman was an interloper, someone who hadn't earned the right to stand in the marble chamber and challenge constitutional orthodoxy. It was the same blind spot that has doomed many figures of authority before her. The inability to see that women of color, forged in struggle, carry with them not just legal knowledge, but lived truth that no textbook can erase. Barrett's own story lacked that struggle. Her path was cushioned by institutions that recognized her potential early and smoothed her ascent. Law schools opened their doors, clerking opportunities paved her way, and political networks ensured her nomination sailed through. She was the embodiment of polished authority, but that polish was fragile, scratched beneath the surface, and it revealed dependency on structures that never questioned her legitimacy. Contrast that with Crockett, a woman whose every step had been contested, whose every achievement was hard-fought. Barrett could not fathom that kind of resilience, and so she underestimated it. She believed a sharp question, laced with condescension, would rattle her opponent into silence. She mistook calmness for weakness, silence for uncertainty. What she could not see, was that Crockett's composure was not hesitation but strategy, a discipline forged through years of navigating rooms designed to exclude her. That is why Barrett's remark landed not as a devastating blow, but as a revelation. It revealed to the nation, in one careless moment, the arrogance that lay beneath her veneer. It showed that the guardian of tradition was not simply protecting the Constitution. She was protecting a hierarchy, one where voices like Crockett's were never meant to rise. And in that instant, the careful image constructed around Barrett began to wobble. Because authority built on polish alone is authority that cannot withstand scrutiny. It shines brightly under controlled light, but in the raw glare of confrontation, the cracks begin to show. Barrett's question was supposed to diminish Crockett. Instead, it diminished herself. The smirk, the dismissive tone, the audacity of the interruption, it all betrayed an arrogance that millions watching could feel. The contradiction between the humility she preached and the contempt she displayed was too stark to ignore. For the first time, the audience saw not just a justice in robes, but a woman wielding power as a weapon to belittle. And once that perception took hold, it could not be undone. What Barrett failed to grasp was that arrogance, once exposed, rarely survives the storm of truth. Her attack had been meant to silence, but instead, it opened the stage for a reckoning. And that arrogance would soon meet its reckoning. Long before the marble pillars of the Supreme Court loomed over her, Jasmine Crockett had walked hallways where the ceilings always seemed too low, the doors too heavy, and the whispers too loud. She was the daughter of struggle, raised in a world that expected her to settle for less, but fueled by a family that taught her never to bow her head. Her mother worked double shifts. Her father carried calloused hands home every night, both instilling in her the lesson that dignity isn't given, it's earned. That lesson stayed with her through the restless nights of childhood, when she would sit by the glow of a cheap desk lamp, her textbooks open, her mind fixed on the idea that law wasn't just words on paper. Law, to her, was survival. In college, while others partied or coasted, Crockett was often the last one in the library. The janitors would flicker the lights, signaling closing time, and still she would press on, highlighter in hand, chasing down every principle of constitutional law as though her life depended on it. Because in a way it did. She knew the world wouldn't hand her respect. She would have to demand it with knowledge so sharp, so undeniable, that even those who dismissed her would have to listen. Law school only hardened that fire. Professors called on her with skepticism, waiting for mistakes, waiting for hesitation. When she stumbled, the silence in the room carried an edge sharper than any spoken word. But Crockett learned to turn that silence into fuel. She absorbed every slight, every dismissal, and built armor out of it. For every time they tried to talk over her, she came back with clearer arguments. For every time they rolled their eyes, she returned with citations they couldn't refute. After earning her degree, Crockett didn't chase prestige. She didn't run toward lucrative firms or cushy positions. Instead, she planted herself in the trenches, representing the unheard, the voiceless, the people without lobbyists or headlines. She defended protesters, fought for the wrongly accused, and stood up for tenants being steamrolled by landlords who thought poverty meant weakness. Courtrooms that ignored them were forced to pause when Crockett spoke. Judges who brushed aside their pleas had to reconsider when Crockett presented the facts. Her work wasn't glamorous. It was exhausting. Late nights poring over evidence. Early mornings meeting clients who had already given up hope. Yet those battles gave her something more valuable than any salary: credibility. In communities where lawyers were distrusted and politicians were dismissed, Crockett became something rare, a fighter who showed up, again and again, no matter how small the case, no matter how big the opponent. That credibility carried her into activism, where she clashed with city officials and confronted policies designed to marginalize. Her speeches at community rallies weren't polished like a politician's, but raw, urgent, real. And the people responded. They saw themselves in her grit, in her refusal to be cowed. When she ran for office, it wasn't ambition that drove her, it was demand. Communities begged her to step forward because they needed someone who wouldn't fold when the weight of power pressed down. As a congresswoman, the skepticism followed her, the same whispers from law school now echoing in the halls of Washington. She was too loud, too direct, too unwilling to play the game. But Crockett knew something her critics didn't. She had been underestimated her whole life, and every single time, she had turned that underestimation into fuel. There were moments when the silencing felt unbearable. Moments when male colleagues talked over her on the floor, when commentators mocked her tone, when panels dismissed her expertise. But Crockett had been silenced before, and she had always come back stronger. She knew that dignity was not about never being attacked. It was about standing taller after every attempt to push you down. And that's what made her so dangerous to people like Barrett. Crockett's resilience wasn't theoretical. It was lived. It was tested in classrooms where professors doubted her, in courts where clients' lives hung in the balance, in neighborhoods where survival wasn't guaranteed. Barrett could throw questions, could sling condescension, could lean on centuries of institutional authority, but Crockett had faced far worse and walked away with her dignity intact. That's why, when Barrett interrupted her, Crockett didn't react with outrage. She didn't need to. She had lived this scene 1,000 times before. The smug smirk, the dismissive question, the room waiting to see if she would crumble. It was a script she knew by heart. And she knew how to rewrite it. Because Crockett carried with her something Barrett could never touch, the hammer of truth forged in struggle. Every insult, every doubt, every attempt to silence her had only made that hammer stronger. So when Justice Barrett came swinging, Crockett was already holding the hammer of truth. The courtroom, already tense, began to tighten like a vice. Barrett, emboldened by her own interruption, leaned forward once more. "Congresswoman, please spare us the theatrics. We are here to discuss constitutional interpretation, not political speeches." Her tone was clipped, each word sharpened to belittle. Crockett opened her mouth to respond, but Barrett cut across her again. "If you cannot address the precedent directly, perhaps we should move on to someone better equipped." A hush rippled through the chamber. Once was rude, twice was deliberate, 3 times would be an assault on decorum itself. But Barrett didn't stop. When Crockett finally began outlining her position, a careful, methodical walk through constitutional protections and the lived realities they touched, Barrett interrupted a 3rd time. "That's a misreading, Congresswoman. And frankly, it betrays a lack of understanding of even the most basic legal principles." The arrogance was suffocating. Reporters shifted in their seats, pens scribbling furiously. Court clerks tried not to meet each other's eyes. The audience, already electrified, began to feel something deeper: outrage. This wasn't the usual back and forth of legal debate. This was targeted dismissal, a performance of superiority aimed not at the substance of the argument, but at the person daring to make it. And yet, through it all, Crockett remained composed. Not a flicker of anger crossed her face. Her voice didn't rise, her gestures didn't betray frustration. She let Barrett's words hang in the air, let the arrogance expose itself. And in that stillness, the imbalance became glaring. One woman wrapped in the trappings of power, cutting and sneering. The other, calm, steady, unshaken. That composure rattled Barrett in ways she hadn't expected. She had assumed Crockett would stumble, would lash back emotionally, would play into the stereotype of being too fiery. Instead, Crockett's restraint made Barrett's interruptions look petty. Each smug dismissal now sounded less like authority and more like insecurity. The audience could feel the shift. Onlookers weren't nodding along with Barrett. They were leaning toward Crockett, waiting for her to speak, aching for her to be heard. Social media posts began flying in real time. "Why won't Barrett let Crockett finish? This is disrespect, plain and simple." Hashtags sprouted, catching fire within minutes. Inside the chamber, the silence after Barrett's 3rd interruption grew thick. Even those sympathetic to Barrett could sense the optics collapsing. Authority had crossed into arrogance, and the room knew it. Crockett finally drew a breath, slow and deliberate. Her eyes met Barrett's, steady, unflinching, and without raising her voice, without rushing her words, she began again. The tone was calm, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. She was no longer simply answering a question. She was reclaiming the room. Barrett shifted in her chair, tapping her pen against the bench, her confidence beginning to crack. Because dignity, when wielded with precision, has a way of making arrogance look desperate. The audience felt it too. Heartbeats quickened. Phones hovered, ready to record. They could sense that the silence of dignity was about to give way to the roar of truth. And when Crockett finally chose her words, they would not only dismantle Barrett's attack, they would turn the entire courtroom into witness to something larger than a legal argument. The air grew electric, as though the marble walls themselves knew history was about to bend. Crockett leaned forward, her voice steady, her eyes sharp. And then, with one sentence, Crockett flipped the entire room. The room hung on the edge of silence. Crockett's composure, her steady gaze, her refusal to be baited, it all led here. Everyone could feel it, though they couldn't quite name it. The marble chamber seemed to vibrate with expectation, waiting for her voice to finally break the tension Barrett had stretched too far. Crockett leaned forward, her tone low but deliberate, the rhythm of someone who had been in 1,000 smaller battles before this one. "Justice Barrett," she began, "you ask whether I am fit to speak on constitutional law. But perhaps the real question is whether constitutional law remains fit to speak for the people it was written to protect." A pause. Sharp. Surgical. The words landed like a gavel. Barrett's smirk flickered. Crockett continued, her voice steady, measured, carrying the rhythm of a seasoned trial lawyer. "I may not have sat on this bench in a robe, insulated by networks of privilege, but I have sat in courtrooms at 2 in the morning defending clients who couldn't afford a lawyer, who faced losing everything because of loopholes in the very laws you praise. I've watched judges dismiss their humanity as though it were irrelevant to the Constitution. I know the law not as a shield for the powerful, but as a weapon too often turned against the powerless." Barrett's pen froze mid-tap. The murmurs in the gallery swelled. Crockett pressed on, each sentence layered like bricks in a wall too strong to be toppled. The Constitution was not written for one class, one color, or one creed. It was written and amended and fought over because this country kept learning again and again that democracy dies when we silence the people who dare to speak from the margins. My voice here is not an accident. It is the direct result of every amendment, every march, every sacrifice that insisted the words, "We the people," must mean all the people. Barrett tried to cut in. "Congresswoman." But this time, the audience stirred audibly. Murmurs of disapproval rippled across the chamber. A few gasps, even a quiet, "Let her speak," carried over the benches. For the first time, Barrett looked unsettled, her authority challenged not by Crockett's volume, but by the crowd's hunger for her words. Crockett held her ground, letting the murmurs settle before she continued. "You claim humility while asking if I am fit to speak. But humility is not questioning another's worth. Humility is listening. Humility is remembering that power exists to serve, not to dismiss. And if the Constitution is to mean anything in this century, it cannot be guarded by those who silence. It must be expanded by those who understand silence all too well." The pause she let follow was deliberate, a silence that dared anyone to miss its weight. Then came the pivot, the strike no one expected. Crockett invoked precedent, her tone precise, her cadence undeniable. Brown versus Board, Loving versus Virginia, Obergefell versus Hodges. Every one of those cases was won not because the powerful wished it so, but because those dismissed as unfit, as unworthy, refused to accept silence. The court, in those moments, was forced to remember that its robes are not shields against progress. They are meant to carry justice forward. Barrett shifted again, her hands tightening around her pen, her composure thinning. Crockett's voice softened, drawing the audience closer. "I stand here as a daughter of struggle, a lawyer who has defended those this system would rather forget, a congresswoman who carries the stories of people too often ignored. So yes, I am fit to speak on constitutional law. I am fit because I've lived on the other side of it. And if my presence here unsettles you, perhaps it is not my fitness that is in question, but the fragility of the authority that feels threatened by it." The sentence cut through the chamber like a lightning strike. For a moment, it was as if time itself stopped. Barrett's face betrayed what her words could not. Shock, anger, the dawning realization that she had underestimated her opponent. Crockett wasn't finished. She let the silence linger, then added the final blow, a mix of legal precedent, personal truth, and moral clarity. Justice is not preserved by keeping voices out. Justice is preserved by letting the truth in, even when it makes us uncomfortable. And today, the truth is simple. I belong in this room. Not because you permit it, but because the Constitution, in all its amendments and struggles, demands it. The gallery erupted in a wave of murmurs, some even clapping before being hushed by court officers. Reporters scribbled furiously. The energy was undeniable, a current that had shifted in Crockett's direction. Barrett sat still, staring at her notes, but not reading, her usual composure visibly fractured. Crockett's words had done what few managed, pierced the veneer of judicial authority, not with disrespect, but with undeniable truth. And in that truth, Barrett had no response. No interruption could salvage the imbalance now laid bare. For once, the justice who prided herself on control was left silent. The nation watching knew they had seen a moment that would live far beyond the hearing. A mic drop, yes, but one rooted not in theatrics, rather in the undeniable collision of lived struggle and institutional arrogance. Crockett had not just answered Barrett. She had redefined the stage itself. The cameras captured Barrett staring, her lips pressed thin, her eyes betraying the flicker of doubt. And as the chamber slowly steadied, the finality of what had just unfolded sank in. Jasmine Crockett had not only survived Barrett's attack, she had turned it into a mirror, one that reflected the fragility of power when confronted with dignity. And yet, this was only the beginning, because outside those walls, the reaction was even bigger. The chamber emptied, but the moment refused to die. By the time Crockett stepped outside those marble doors, the world had already seized it, amplified it, and set it ablaze. Within minutes, clips of her mic drop reverberated across every platform, every timeline, every corner of the digital sphere. On Twitter, or what people still instinctively called Twitter, hashtags shot upward like fireworks. Hashtag Crockett own Barrett, hashtag dignity over arrogance, hashtag she belongs here. Millions of views poured in overnight. Short clips of her final words. I belong in this room. Not because you permit it, but because the Constitution demands it. Looped endlessly, stitched into memes, TikToks, and remixes. One edit set her words against the sound of a gavel dropping, punctuating her rebuttal like a beat drop in a song. Another layered her speech over grainy footage of civil rights marches, the connection between past and present made visceral in 30 seconds of video. Commentators scrambled to keep up. Progressive outlets framed it as the defining moment of the year. Crockett didn't just win. One anchor declared breathlessly, she redefined the room. She reminded the court and the country what justice sounds like when spoken from the margins. Even moderate voices admitted they hadn't seen anything like it. It wasn't theater, a usually cautious analyst noted. It was truth delivered with surgical precision. And the silence from Barrett said more than words ever could. By dawn, the reaction had climbed out of politics and into the bloodstream of culture. Celebrities amplified it. A-list actors reposted her speech with captions like, "This is leadership." Musicians added her quotes to their concert backdrops. A famous comedian turned Barrett's smirk into a meme captioned, "When you realize you picked the wrong fight." Even athletes weighed in, one NBA star tweeting, "That's how you hold court." But beyond the virality, something deeper was happening. Crockett's moment had shifted the narrative itself. For years, the story about her was written by others, too brash, too new, too out of her depth. Pundits dismissed her as a noisemaker in Congress, a voice that didn't quite fit into the polished corridors of power. Now, those same voices were forced to reframe. She wasn't the outsider anymore. She was the embodiment of resilience, composure, and dignity in the face of arrogance. She was the mirror America needed, showing what leadership could look like when rooted in lived struggle instead of insulated tradition. Communities felt it most viscerally. In churches, in immigrant centers, in barbershops and cafes, people replayed her words with pride. Parents showed their children the clip and whispered, "This is what courage looks like." Activists who had long felt sidelined saw in her a reflection of their own battles, the daily silencing, the constant underestimation. Crockett had cracked open the walls of the highest court in the land and carried their voices inside. And it wasn't lost on anyone that Barrett, polished, powerful, and insulated, had no answer. That silence echoed as loudly as Crockett's speech. For some, it was a rare moment of accountability. For others, it was proof that dignity could shake even the most rigid pillars of authority. By nightfall, opinion polls showed Crockett's name recognition had surged. Progressive politicians lined up to praise her. Some cautiously hinted she was now more than a congresswoman. She was a rising national figure. Even critics admitted, grudgingly, that she had handled herself with unexpected composure. But for all the noise, all the viral clips, all the headlines, Crockett herself stayed quiet. She didn't flood the airwaves. She didn't call a press conference. She let the moment breathe, knowing that its power lay not in overexposure, but in allowing the nation to sit with what they had just witnessed. And as the country marveled, as hashtags rose and fell, as memes burned bright across feeds, one thing became clear. Crockett had become something more than a politician. She was now a symbol. A voice of dignity in an age drowning in arrogance. A reminder that truth, when spoken with courage, could still break through the thickest walls of power. But Crockett herself wasn't finished. She wanted America to hear the real lesson. When the noise settled, after the trending hashtags, the cable news analysis, the viral edits looping on every screen, Jasmine Crockett finally spoke. Not in another courtroom, not in the halls of Congress, but to a small gathering back home in her district. The cameras were fewer, the setting humble. And yet, what she said there carried the weight of everything that had come before. "This moment was never about me," she began, her voice steady, unadorned. "It was about what we, as a nation, choose to value." That was the heart of it. To some, the clash between Barrett and Crockett looked like just another flashpoint in America's endless partisan wars. But Crockett understood it was bigger. This was the fault line between two visions of America, one clinging to hierarchy and exclusion, the other reaching toward dignity and inclusion, one rooted in arrogance, the other in service. She laid it bare. If we decide that titles and traditions matter more than truth, then we've lost our way. If we let arrogance dictate who belongs in the room, then democracy is only a performance for the powerful. But if we hold to the belief that every voice matters, especially the ones they try hardest to silence, then America still has a chance to become what it promised. Her words rippled like a moral bell tolling across the country. They weren't the angry retorts of someone wronged. They were the steady voice of someone who had carried struggle her entire life and knew how to turn pain into purpose. Crockett didn't seek to humiliate Barrett or anyone else. She sought to remind the nation that the measure of greatness isn't found in who holds the gavel, but in who dares to speak when silenced. And in that reminder, Crockett reframed the entire confrontation. It wasn't Barrett's arrogance that would define the story. It was Crockett's dignity. It wasn't elitism that would endure. It was service. It wasn't power that would leave the deeper mark. It was truth. The moral was as old as America's own contradictions, yet as urgent as the present hour. Dignity beats arrogance, not because it is louder, but because it lasts longer. Arrogance crumbles under the weight of its own self-importance. Dignity, born of struggle and grounded in service, endures. And so the story turned. Crockett became more than a congresswoman, more than a political rising star. She became a living symbol of a new American ethos, one not dictated by who speaks the loudest, but by who stands the firmest. Not by who holds the most privilege, but by who carries the most truth. Cinematic in its simplicity, the image lingered. Crockett, calm amid the storm, unshaken by insult, her words now etched into a broader narrative of what America could be. Where others saw arrogance, she showed dignity. Where others saw tradition as a wall, she wielded truth as a key. And now, the choice is ours. If you believe dignity is louder than arrogance, share this story. If you believe voices like Crockett's are shaping America's future, subscribe and join us, because this movement is only beginning, and it needs every one of us. History isn't written by those who shout the loudest. It's written by those who stand tallest when it matters most. And that's why, sometimes, the loudest voice isn't the one that shouts. It's the one that stands tall.